So guys, today's video is going to consist of some clarifications from yesterday's TWAB. There's a lot of information, so some of this was actually followed up by Bungie afterwards. And then on top of that, Proctor was in an interview last night with Monarque, which by the way, we will link that interview below for you guys to go check out. They got a podcast. Proctor is the weapons lead over at Bungie, and he gives a lot of insight into what's changing in the future and why those changes were being made. But first, some clarifications here. Last Word will not be getting buffed with the hipfire changes. I know yesterday in the TWAB, I was freaking out a little bit about Last Word getting even stronger, but in fact, Last Word will remain untouched, alongside, of course, shotgun, sniper rifles, and fusion rifles. Now, Vex Mythic class was brought up because a lot of people got hyped when they saw the 40% damage buff being handed out to exotic weapons, or exotic primaries. Again, confirmed here by DMG, the 40% PvE damage buff against red bar enemies will not apply to Mythic class, as this exotic actually got a buff last season. So again, I know everybody was getting really excited. They were like, yo, who cares about particle deconstruction? But no, that is not the case. Vex Mythic class is not going to be part of that buff. Now, trace rifles are receiving this 40% buff. And someone actually commented yesterday in our TWAB video and was like, trace rifles aren't going to get a buff because they use special ammo. No, specifically stated here in the TWAB, right next to exotic primaries, trace rifles are also going to be getting a PvE buff against minor enemies by 40%. Just wanted to further clarify that, as I did see some people commenting on that in the TWAB video. Now, actually tweeted out by one of our editors here, Jarrett. He asks, will retrace pass be affected by the 40% trace rifle buff, or is it strictly only exotic trace rifles? DMG immediately confirmed that this will only affect exotic trace rifles. Now, swapping elemental types on a weapon seems to be out of the question. We got really excited yesterday. I am so sorry if I baited y'all. Turns out, even though we see the auto rifle right here come to pass have solar, and then down below, when analyzing the weapon and its traits, you see it have arc damage. Turns out that may actually just be a bug. Stated here from DMG after it was tweeted at him that builds are still in development and a few images shown today might change between now and then. Thanks for the ping though. Teams checking to make sure descriptions and such match appropriately. Now, I don't really know if he's saying that the elements shouldn't have changed, or that in fact, when observing the auto rifle and the weapon crafting section, if that should change to arc or not. Now, normally if Bungie has good news to share, they share it. So if we did have freedom here to change elemental types, DMG would be saying that. So even though we do have a lot here to choose from when it comes to customization for our weapon crafting, I don't believe we're actually going to be able to choose our elemental type. I could still be wrong, and I genuinely hope I am. Now, before we get into the interview part, we do need to bring up some of the emblems that were posted yesterday. Yes, Bungie was giving out a bunch of emblems, but one of the emblems really caught our attention, and that is Liminal Nadir. Now, this was given out with this code right here, and when you redeem it, it looks like this. Now, the reason why this may be significant is because Nadir was actually a foundry inside of Destiny, and Bungie even mentioned a number of the foundries returning, but they mentioned one under Redacted. Now, one of the most known weapons that Nadir made was, of course, Nemesis Star. Nemesis Star was actually an exotic machine gun back inside of Destiny 1, a beautiful weapon, and even had a unique trait there that when holding down the trigger, your range and accuracy increases as the rate of your fire would decrease, and kills would actually grant grenade bonus. But Nadir itself, I don't really know much about. Here from the wiki page, it says that little is known about Nadir and the foundry's origins, and that the term Nadir is most commonly used in astronavigation to refer to the opposite of the zenith, which is the highest point in the sky that an object will reach. Nadir then describes the lowest point in the sky that an object will reach. Both Nadir and zenith come to English by the way of Latin, and both words are originally from Arabic. Now, the only written information we have in Destiny about Nadir is the Grimoire card for Nemesis Star, which asks several questions without providing any answers. However, there may be clues in the card for some of my lore masters out there, as the card actually stated what is the answer when the question is extinction. Now, apparently, Nadir's answer was Nemesis Star, this powerful and formidable machine gun. And perhaps the Foundry's name refers to the point in humanity's history when they first began making weapons, post-Golden Age collapse. Regardless, it's interesting that Bungie would give out a code like this. I know they gave out a bunch of them, but considering they mentioned the Redacted Foundry, makes you kind of wonder, right, fellas? I think one of the most known weapons inside of Destiny 2 that is supposed to fall under the Nadir faction, or the Nadir Foundry, is Azimuth, which is a hand cannon that many players used inside of Destiny 2 because of the fact that it could roll with aggressive frame and, of course, kill clip. Either way it goes, there's a lot of speculation of what that foundry could be, but that's our guess on it. Now, moving on to the interview portion of this video. Again, guys, if you want to watch this podcast, it's only like an hour and a half. Proctor speaks live on there. Mercules and them ask a ton of great questions, so please go check that out. With that being said, let's talk about some of the things that were touched on, and again, some of these were even mentioned in the TWAB, but essentially, we'll start with what pursuit weapons are. And essentially, they mention it being a 3/4 of a god roll or 70% of a god roll. And that the real reason why they moved away from pinnacle weapons was number one, they were a little too strong, and number two, they were actually expensive to design. And I will admit, pinnacle weapons did take away from the meta. It became the centerpiece, right? For everything. Even though I was against pinnacle weapons going away, I was more against losing pursuit-like weapons for core activities versus pinnacle weapons. Now, origin traits became a big topic, as that really does change the design of a weapon. I know a lot of people are already saying, great, now I have to regrind all these guns for these origin traits, and that's exactly right. That is the dark side to weapons 3.0. But this is the way you want to sunset weapons. Back in the day, whenever Bungie actually introduced sunsetting, it was a terrible idea. You're taking away our weapons and giving us essentially the same stuff over again. With this new take though, with origin traits and foundry traits, and the ability to have identities and themes with each of these, there's a reason to go for that next weapon. There's a reason to choose it over your current arsenal. So essentially, we voluntarily will sunset our own weapons. And I know a lot of you may be upset about that, but again, you put an auto rifle in my hand from Trials of Osiris, and it comes with this alacrity perk alongside whatever god roll I can roll it with. Of course I'm gonna take it. And that's the same with all these traits. I think what I like the most is the example they showed on the Herit C auto rifle from Gamut. The fact that this weapon is a hockey auto rifle, but it's also coming from Gamut, it will have the option to go between both of those traits depending on what you're doing. Now moving on, they did bring up the issues with bottomless grief and celerity when talking about these origin traits. Origin traits essentially are just better options as they can be fitted alongside your trait combinations versus just taking the place of what you may already have as a god roll. And I felt that way about bottomless grief and celerity. It was more of an option to choose. If my roll was so bad, that was my next best thing on my adept weapon. Now they did mention though that things like celerity being as strong as it is, don't expect alacrity to be that strong. It's like celerity light, which the target acquisition that celerity grants is very, very good. You just have to be the last living member of your fire team. But the fact is that alacrity is going to be able to be used in solo content and in things like Rumble. Those stat bumps alone from alacrity are going to make these trials weapons a go-to choice for many things. Which is kind of scary, but we'll see how it plays out. Now, in terms of scope here for loot that we're getting here inside of Witch Queen, we're actually going to be getting 42 new legendary weapons being added. Now, 12 of those are actually going to be Foundry weapons, which will be added to the Royal Loot Pool. And not added, but actually replacing the Royal Loot Pool, which does take us to the Royal Loot Pool. Guys, this is only going to consist of Foundry weapons with an additional 4 added each new season. Now, we are going to make kind of a loot warning guide here in the next day or so, going over the Royal Loot Pool and what's actually going away and my suggestions on what to lock down. But again, though, eventually, especially considering all these Foundry perks and traits and these origin traits, I think it's going to be worth replacing what you currently have when the time comes. Now, you probably saw the numbers are now being present on in-game stat bars. This is a new change, and a lot of people are liking it right now, guys. You're able to actually see your impact, your range, your stability, etc. And they even mentioned that in the future, they're going to try to add in those hidden stats, zoom, aim assist, etc. No longer will you have to go to third-party websites. Even though I love LightGG as well as the Gunsmith, it still would be nice to be able to view all these things in-game. Now, a conversation got brought up about exotics and adding mods to those exotics. He was even asked, could we see things like Icarus on the last word? I feel like this is often brought up, but Chris Proctor even brought up that this would actually break a lot of exotics. He gave the example of Hawkmoon with backup plan would be broken. Ace of Spade with Icarus would be way too powerful. So at least for now, don't expect any mods being added to exotics. Now, with the change to the 40% buff there to exotic primaries inside of PvE, one of the standout weapons that was brought up was Graviton Lance. Matter of fact, Chris Proctor said, and I quote, Graviton Lance is wild with this change. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, Graviton Lance is getting a 10% buff because it's a pulse rifle. And number two, it's also getting a 40% buff because it's an exotic primary. And multiplicatively, this is actually a 54% increase in damage. Now, obviously, other primary exotic pulse rifles are going to benefit from this. Outbreak, Bad Juju. Graviton Lance is just one of those that pops up a little more because in the terminology used in the TWAB, it was stated that perk trigger explosions will also be included in these secondary effects. And if you shoot something like Graviton Lance inside of PvE, that cosmology perk puts in some work. We also have Void 3.0 in our minds. So the question comes up, will there be any type of synergy at all between some of our Void subclasses tied into our exotic? Probably not. Either way, Graviton Lance with that big of a buff, it's going to be nasty. Moving on, Roadborne was technically affected by proxy, but was not touched directly. Now, this is in regards to Chaperone and the nerf it received in its range. Roadborne is still going to be a good perk, but again, that 1.5 meter drop is going to be included when Roadborne is active. But in terms of its target acquisition, I think Roadborne is still going to be very, very strong. I think Chaperone, when it gets a precision kill, will be still very, very strong. But in its base form, this is a huge nerf to Chaperone. Chaperone. Now, Ruinous Effigy was brought up because it's actually going to be getting a buff. They're going to be increasing the damage dealt by Guardians with the Transmutation Sphere by 66%. And you'll also be able to create orbs with Ruinous Effigy when combined with Orb Generation armor mods. Now, the conversation got brought up about this one because they asked, why was Ruinous Effigy even nerfed to begin with? Chris actually stated that the usage spiked heavily when Ruinous first came out. I think he said something like 50%, which it was just such a fun gun to use, right? Everybody was slam dunking. We were. I loved it. They actually stated, though, that Ruinous probably would have died out had they just left it alone, but essentially that's why we're seeing the buff now. Now, Lumina, Chris actually agreed that this is a huge buff to its range, and it is. It's going from 44 to 59. Is Lumina going to be meta? No, at least not for PvP. Again, what makes Lumina somewhat of an issue is when you're actually shooting. If you shoot too fast before you're aiming down sights, but you happen to have noble rounds, you'll just poop out a noble round and not actually shoot the bullets. So until Lumina actually gets some sort of way to like reload function activate its noble rounds, I don't really know if Lumina will ever be a choice I would use outside of just playing purely support, which that's ideally what it's supposed to be, right? It's a support weapon. It's supposed to lean into that healing class. Now, Chris did bring up Monarque and agreed that it is a bit of a problem and we could expect future tuning. I know a lot of people asked last week in our 4 weapons that needed tuning and our 4 exotics that were outliers why I didn't include Monarque on this list. It's annoying, but I'm not exactly getting killed by it every game, but I hear people are dealing with it more on console. Either way it goes, expect future tuning to Monarque at some point. Now, if you're an avid Monarque user, do not be distraught. Chris Proctor also confirmed that Monarque is going to get an exotic catalyst. So yeah, it is going to potentially get a nerf, but I'm sure the catalyst is going to be well worth the trade-off. Now, Flinch has been added to Lawrence and Arbalest to make them less oppressive, but Chris actually said that he doesn't think this will be enough and that further change is queued up for season 17 to deal with these linears. We'll just have to see. Again, I have gone between both input devices, and I would say even for both, even while I'm taking like a face full of Ace of Spades or something, Lawrence will still land the crits, right? So hopefully the flinch changes are going to be somewhat noticeable next season. Now, 140s from 150s. I quote, in a world where these weapons never leave the pool, it is important we bring them in line. Now, this is in regards to Dire Promise, Waking Vigil, Jack Queen King, and Spare Rations, all getting a range buff to put them in line with 140s. Again, that was the trade-off back in the day. It was like 150s had less range, technically, but they had a faster time to kill. When they were converted to 140s, though, they no longer had that time to kill value, and they had worse range by default. Now, the question that came up is really not in regards to the range bump, but actually Jack Queen King and Spare Rations. Bungie, why would you be buffing both of those weapons if you weren't planning to bring them back? Will these be re-entering the pool? For some reason, no one seems to be asking this question. So I will ask it for us. Are these weapons coming back? Will I see a Spare Rations at some point again? We'll see. Now, Eager's Edge was brought up in regards to the nerf that it's receiving. Now, it was stated that Eager's Edge is still going to be good. It's still going to move at about 8 meters per second versus 20 meters a second, which to me, when I see that, that sounds bad. That sounds like a hefty nerf. So not only is the lunge distance being reduced, but also the speed. Either way it goes, Chris did mention that people that are dedicated to speed running and skating should still be able to do so with Eager's Edge. Now, flinch was brought up, and this seems to be a topic that keeps circling itself back around here. What I got from the conversation was more flinch against special weapons is good. Less flinch against primary weapons is what Bungie wants to get up to. So in the future, we should be able to build into combating flinch while using our primary weapons. So instead of it being a toss-up while taking gunfire, again, to me, it's not really just a matter of flinch. It's really just high caliber rounds, man. Like, I know exactly when I'm getting hit by a weapon that has high cal. You know, if you go ahead and combat flinch like this, it's just gonna drive more usage for high caliber rounds. Hell, we'll just start maining Ace of Spades again. Now, Pulse Rifle. There is a planned buff for Pulse Rifles in the future for PvP, more specifically archetypes that are dead, namely lightweight Pulse Rifles. I know we just got the BXR as well, which is in that same archetype, but not necessarily a lightweight. I think the reason why they're wanting to do this, and we mentioned this the other day, is we've seen that Amalon Pulse Rifle in the trailer, as well as in the TWAB. And we're going to continue seeing more Amalon Pulse Rifles that are lightweights if they plan on bringing back things like Nurgle and Agenda. Regardless though, be expecting a buff at some point. Maybe that'll be season 17. Who knows? Either way it goes, guys, I may have missed some things. If there's anything that I missed, feel free to comment it down below. If you're new here, stick around. We cover everything in this game, man. I'm living and breathing Destiny right now. I feel like I'm dreaming about Sabbathic. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.